In Muslim-majority societies around the world, some knowledge of the Qur'an and its contents is usually taken for granted, much as many Americans, regardless of their religious identity, have some knowledge of stories and metaphors drawn from the Bible. In many Muslim-majority contexts, the Qur'an is ubiquitous. Verses from the Qur'an will be inscribed in calligraphy on buildings, stenciled onto taxicabs, and hung in framed posters in people's homes. Meanwhile, the sound of Quranic recitation can be heard from mosques, streets, and the windows of passing cars. The importance of the Qur'an to the daily lives of Muslims around the world speaks to the importance of understanding at least some of the basics of this rich and influential text. However, to discuss this influential text, we actually have to start by discussing Muhammad, as the themes and meaning of the Qur'an make little sense outside of the context of his life. The story of the life of Muhammad stems primarily from biographies produced by Muslim scholars who wrote about 100 to 200 years after his death. According to these accounts, Muhammad was born in the Arabian desert around the year 570 to a family of traders. Orphaned as a child, he was raised by his uncle and grandfather until he married and settled down in the major trading town of Mecca. The people of Mecca, like most of the nomadic Arabs during this time, were polytheists who worshipped a number of gods, and the city contained a large stone shrine that housed the statues of these deities. As he got older, Muhammad became increasingly disaffected by life in Mecca and spent more and more time meditating alone in the hills on the outskirts of town. And it was there, in a cave on a remote mountainside, that God spoke to Muhammad for the first time. For Muslims, the Qur'an is no less than the direct record of God's speech to Muhammad, as revealed, first on that mountain, and then at many other points over the rest of his life. Muhammad, in turn, is known as the prophet, or the messenger of God. Within the Qur'an, Muhammad is described as the last of a long series of prophets, which include the biblical patriarchs such as Adam, Noah, Abraham, and Moses, New Testament figures such as John the Baptist and Jesus, and several Arab prophets unknown to biblical tradition. The Qur'an affirms that Muhammad inherited the mantle of these previous figures, that he was charged to correct earlier teachings that had become corrupted or lost, and that his message would serve as God's final word and warning to humankind. According to his biographers, after the initial revelation, Muhammad returned to Mecca and began telling others what he had learned. Over the next several years, he preached in Mecca, attempting to persuade the people of the city to abandon their many gods and turn to the one God who had revealed himself to Muhammad. While these efforts did attract a small band of followers, most of the people of Mecca, and the elites in particular, remained opposed to Muhammad and his followers. Eventually, Muhammad received a message from a nearby oasis called Yathrib. The several tribes inhabiting the oasis could not resolve their feuds and required a mediator. The leaders of Yathrib agreed to welcome Muhammad and follow his guidance if he could bring peace to their troubled community. Facing increased persecution from the Meccans and beginning to fear for their lives, Muhammad and his followers escaped from Mecca and relocated to Yathrib, which was renamed Medina an-Nabi, the city of the Prophet, or just Medina. This moment in which Muhammad and his community leave their family in Mecca and establish themselves as a new and independent community in Medina is called the Hijra, the flight or exodus. It marks the beginning of the Islamic calendar, the year 0, and is one of the most iconic moments in Muslim historical imagination. From the new base in Medina, Muhammad's community would not only grow, but thrive, and his followers would ultimately take back Mecca only a few short months before his death. The Hijra to Medina plays an important role in the structure and themes of the Qur'an as well. The Qur'an is not organized chronologically, and although it contains stories, most of them are fragmented and scattered throughout. The Qur'an was apparently kept alive as an oral tradition during Muhammad's life and immediately following his death. It was only decades after he died that his followers wrote down the various verses and collected them into a compiled written text. When his followers did write down the Qur'an, they grouped verses together thematically into chapters, and then organized the chapters from longest to shortest. So the Qur'an does not start at the beginning, and in fact, most Muslims will start reading the Qur'an from the back. Muhammad's life changed drastically from his time in Mecca to his time in Medina, and the Qur'an itself reflects this change. In Mecca, he was a preacher, calling people to accept a new and urgent message. In contrast, the Quranic verses revealed in Medina reflect Muhammad's role as leader of a large, complex community. These sections deal with issues of social regulation, marriage, inheritance, warfare, as well as the details of sacred history. When young Muslims begin to read the Quran, which many do as young children, they begin with the shortest chapters from Mecca. These chapters outline the core of the Quran's message, its central call. Scholars see a set of central themes in these chapters and believe that Muhammad's early community was preoccupied with three major themes. First, God is the only God. This message is made clear in the last chapter of the Quran.
قل أعوذ برب الناس ملك الناس إله الناس.
Second, the day of judgment is approaching. Several chapters portray an imminent moment of reckoning when the order of the world will be overturned and everyone will be called to account.
إذا السماء انفطرت وإذا الكواكب انتثرت وإذا البحار فجرت وإذا القبور بعثرت.
And third, a call to justice and an ethical life, as seen in verses like these from the morning hours.
والضحى والليل إذا سجى ما ودعك ربك وما قلى وللآخرة خير لك من الأولى ولسوف يعطيك ربك فترضى ألم يجدك يتيما فآوى.
From the insistence on and the repetition of these themes, scholars believe that Muhammad's earliest followers were radically monotheistic and apocalyptic. They urged the establishment of a community rooted in devotion to one God and called for that community to devote itself to the poor and the marginalized in preparation for an imminent end, a quickly approaching day of judgment.